when you put yourself in front of, between President Reagan and John Hinckley, Special Agent in Charge Jerry Parr pushed President Reagan into the limousine sped off. Did you remain there, or did you make it in the limo as well?
No, I was shot in the right chest, and I was down on the ground. The limo left and headed towards the White House initially because I still had my radio on. I could hear what was happening. Jerry, once he saw blood coming from the president's mouth, redirected it to the George Washington University Hospital.
Was it at that point over the radio that you did learn that the president, in fact, had been shot?
Well, I thought so. I thought that's what happened, and I was kind of wondering what happened to me as well. I think I knew what happened, and moments later, ambulances arrived, and we were all transported to different hospitals.
That is Orland Park Police Chief Tim McCarthy and former Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy, who very possibly saved the president's life, President Ronald Reagan. It's the Kevin Kollins Show on 1340 WJOL. That was an interview we did with Tim McCarthy, was it 2 years ago, Evan, or a year ago? I think it was last year. One of the favorite interviews I've ever done on this program. A man that I'd always wanted to get on, and he agreed to come on last year around the anniversary of President Reagan's assassination. Sorry, Evan, there you go. Sorry.
He actually came on after Mr. Brady passed away.
Yes.
And we had tried to get him since the show started. You had said that he was one of the guys you wanted to get. And he does not really talk about it. He doesn't grant a lot of interviews. He very much does not like to discuss that specific situation. But after Mr. Brady passed away from his wounds from being shot on that day, he agreed to come on. And we talked a little bit with him about whether or not we thought that murder charges would be pursued against John Hinckley in the murder of Brady, and kind of eventually got him to open up about the events that took place that day.
Yeah, it was a fascinating interview. I mean, this, again, he is currently the police chief of Orland Park. He was a Secret Service agent at that time. The reason I'm going back and touching on this is obviously John Hinckley's been in the news the last month or so. It does appear a judge has somewhat indicated it looks like John Hinckley is going to be released from the mental institution. There will be some restrictions, but it looks like he will be housed with either his parents outside of the mental institution. But also there's a great piece out, came out yesterday from the Dallas Morning News, a in-depth investigative report at that day, some 34 years ago, in March is when it happened. 34 years ago, back in March, when President Reagan, the assassination attempt happened on his 70th day is all in office. He'd only been in office for 70 days. And a couple of things that come out of this that the Dallas Morning News piece goes on. It goes in depth, first of all, about the assassinations, what it starts off with. It talks about, Hinckley firing 6 shots from that little .22 revolver. It also talked about, Secretary of State Alexander Haig's declaration, I'm in control here. In fact, Vice President Bush was in Air Force One.
And he was in charge of the situation.
And the article goes in also, they actually interviewed former President Bush about this, and he agreed to do an interview via email. And they talked a lot about President Bush, Vice President Bush's at that time, graciousness and not ever really making a big thing out of what Alexander Haig did, and just kind of, doing it graciously.
It's a wonderful read.
It really is. It's a really good article.
Read because George Bush, say what you will about him as a president in those 4 years in charge. That situation in particular, he very much could have taken Alexander Haig and torn him down. Yeah. And he decided not to do that. I mean, it's all these years later, but still to have the graciousness to say that, well, I was in command, so there was never any worry. Even when that situation was taking place, everyone knew who was in charge. I think a little more has been made of it than it actually was. I mean, that's a very gracious tact to take, but it is still stunning that in the aftermath of that, and it wasn't a coup or anything like that, but it was just the idea of someone who was not in charge
saying they're
trying
the president,
to exert his authority, saying, I'm the president right
and
now.
It wasn't really necessarily, they make it look like it wasn't really a mistake, that it wasn't like, oh wait, that he Alexander Haig really wanted to be, the guy in charge, and that it was. But they interviewed George H.W. Bush via email, and they asked him, what did you think immediately after you heard President Reagan had been shot? He said, I recall thinking about Nancy and the president when I first heard how bad the situation really was. Even though it was still early in this administration, I didn't think about them as president and first lady, but rather as friends. It goes into then, again, back to the shooting. Hinckley's first 2 bullets, as we know, hit Press Secretary Jim Brady in the forehead, police Tom Delaney in the neck. Standing almost against the car, Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy. He turned to shield the president, was lifted off his feet as a bullet struck his chest. In the driver's seat, agent Drew Unruh watched his friend McCarthy fall from view. Now, behind the president, Secret Service Special Agent in charge, Jerry Parr, and that's who Tim McCarthy was talking about in the interview I did with him. He grabbed Reagan's waist and left shoulder and threw the 70-year-old headfirst into the floor of the armored limousine. His chest crashed against the transmission hump as Parr landed on top of him. On the sidewalk, Ray Shattuck shoved their dangling feet inside and slammed the door. Get out of here, go, 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 Parr shouted. With the rest of the motorcade still curbside, Unruh veered left and prayed, God, don't let me run over Timmy, referring to Tim McCarthy, who had fallen to the street really very near the limousine. President's car sped off. Parr raised his head, saw a spider web mark from a stray round on the bulletproof passenger window. He said, boy, somebody really tried to kill the president. At this point, in the limousine, speeding towards the White House, Parr ran both of his hands up under Reagan's arms and across his back in search of blood, and he found none. The Secret Service agent reached over the seat for Unruh's radio microphone. Using Reagan's code name, he said, Rawhide is okay, Rawhide is okay. It was at that point that Reagan grimaced in pain. And Parr thought immediately and said to President Reagan, is it your heart? And President Reagan said, no, I think you broke my rib. Reagan reached in his jacket pocket for a paper napkin he had grabbed after his speech at the Hilton, and he wiped his lips and saw blood. He said, I must have cut the inside of my mouth. It was at this point that Parr made the decisions. 80 seconds after the shooting, Reagan was beginning to lose blood in his face. He was getting ashen looking. Mr. President, we're going to GW Hospital, which was at that point the limousine raced to the hospital. Then it's at that point we start hearing some of the stories about President Reagan, even in that situation, that life and death situation, with some humor that he used. When they got there, they ended up in Trauma Bay 5. A nurse placed a cuff on Reagan's arm, pumped it up, and listened for his blood pressure. The nurse said, I don't hear anything. Am I dying? Reagan asks. My God, he's Code City, which is the code for Code Blue. The paramedics stared at the president's colorless face. Leaning down with the stethoscope, surgical resident Wes Price heard normal breathing in the right lung, but almost no sound in his left lung. They cut his suit away. They found under his left armpit a narrow slit. Drew Scheel had served in Vietnam and recognized right away that it was a gunshot wound. And it was at that point that the president was pronounced Code Blue.
And it has actually been determined that he was not shot directly by Hinckley. When he was being pushed into the limo, a bullet ricocheted off the limousine and actually ended up hitting President Reagan as they were throwing him in. It was a 1 in a million shot, but it unfortunately ended up hitting the president.
Well, the interesting thing about that bullet, too, it hit the armored rear quarter panel of the limo, and it flattened out into the shape of a dime, ricocheted, and that's why it made that slit look right in his side. And it punctured a lung, stopped an inch from his heart, and the president's chest was filling with blood. It's a fascinating read. Again, it's the Dallas Morning News, and it's really, really, really fascinating. This is...
Crisis management is in effect.
Who is making the decisions for the government right now? Who's making the decisions?
Constitutionally, gentlemen, you have the president, the vice president, and the secretary of state in that order. And should the president decide he wants to transfer the helm to the vice president, he will do so. As of now, I am in control here in the White House, pending return of the vice president, and in close touch with him. If something came up, I would check with him, of course.
A Reagan official later called those remarks eminently stupid. Vice President Bush watched on the plane's TV, saying nothing. He soon arrived at the White House, took the helm, warmly greeted Alexander Haig. He came in perfect equanimity. equanimity. The vice president visited Nancy Reagan, spoke on national television, suggested that officials create an air of normalcy prior to the president's return. It's a great read.